Hello and welcome to the lecture presentation for week 4 of Philosophy 111, Ethics and Cultural Issues in Science and Technology. And this week we're going to be looking at the contribution of feminist theory to the theoretical question of technology. And we're going to have another closer look at feminism in the second half of the course, when we're going to look a bit more deeply at some of the concrete issues and take a look at some applications in a bit more depth. But here we want to sort of think about the theoretical question of the feminist perspective on technology studies, and we're going to look at two articles to help us do that this week: Wendy Faulkner's The Technology Question in Feminism and Els Rom's Feminist Interventions in the Design Process, which is going to talk about the sort of process of design and how to make it more of a kind of feminist process. So we're going to take a look at these two essays this week. All right, so there are two different feminist approaches that we can discern. Sort of broadly speaking, there's a kind of liberal approach that focuses on access, and there's a radical approach that focuses more specifically on social change and sees the need for a more kind of root and branch transformation of society to really bring about the changes that feminism calls for. So the sort of liberal approach or idea focuses on access and uses regulation often to sort of bring about greater access. So it sees the problem as one of lack of access of women to the areas, the professional fields where science is done and where technology is sort of designed and created. And it sees the solution as opening up access to those areas. So typically getting more women into science, and it might focus on educational initiatives. It might focus on employment initiatives to try to increase the pool of women who are interested in science and interested in pursuing it as a career. Identifying uses and abuses of science and technology, so cases where it's used sort of inappropriately to push a gender norm instead of sort of in the intrinsic uses of the technology itself. And what's sort of characteristic of the liberal approach is the idea of technology as a neutral artifact. So it's neither good nor bad. It's neither positive nor negative. It all depends on the use. And we've talked about that idea, and we've seen that idea questioned in sort of systematic accounts of technology that sort of take up how technology can take on can sort of be part of an elaborate system. And then we've also seen claims when we talked about Feinberg that technology can sort of represent the interests of a specific group of people, and we'll come back to that idea as well very soon. But these are the sort of the liberal access approach, where the problem is sort of the lack of avenues for women to pursue careers in science and to have sort of design roles in technology. And sort of once we overcome that problem, then the problem will cease to exist. So liberal feminist theory evolved from liberal feminism, and in the focus on technology, and it imitates principles of liberty and equality in the context of women. It claims the idea of gender equality, believes intellectually men and women are the same, and combines feminist ideals with humanistic ideals for the sort of growth and flourishing of humanity. So it sort of has a very sort of positive focus on coming from its humanism, the idea of sort of human flourishing, and sort of setting out the conditions to promote human flourishing. And all it says is that we need to sort of equalize the balance so that women have an equal role to pursue that flourishing. So it sees sexism or sort of discriminatory behavior as depriving society of one half of its creative force. So it's almost as though the problem with sexism is a sort of a loss of productivity, almost, that you're making half of the population less educated, less productive, less able, less capable than they would otherwise be if they were given equal access to education, careers, and so on. And it says things like, it's in society's interest that, jobs are fulfilled by the best qualified individual, whether that person is male or female. So it's a social good to promote ideas of equality and to promote women's flourishing. So that's kind of the standpoint of liberal feminism. It doesn't sort of have a deeper critique of economic relations, but it sees that the problem is able to be solved by changing the structure of access, by giving greater access to women to fulfill these roles, and it believes that will sort of transform the inequality problem, and that will lead to an equal society. So radical feminism considers the male-controlled capitalist hierarchy, sort of sexist hierarchy as it describes it, as the defining feature of women's oppression. So it sees that problem is not going to be solved. The inequality problem won't be solved unless we deal with these economic and social structures that keep gender relations in this sort of hierarchical subordinate form. And only when the broader economic relations have changed would we see any movement here towards equality. So feminists of the sort of feminists who take a more radical approach, what they say is that we need a much more substantial social and economic change to bring about the equality that we all want to see. And in the absence of that equality, we're not, in the absence of that radical change, incremental measures are not going to be strong enough to sort of pull against that structure and to sort of transform it. So women can free themselves only when they have done away with what they consider an inherently oppressive and dominating patriarchal system. So again, it's sort of the patriarchal system that you can't sort of change that by individuals making individual decisions. You have to change that by winning power, political and social power, and then using that power to transform the workings of the system itself. All right, so let's start by looking at Wendy Faulkner's essay on the technology question in feminism. And she comes out of a background in technology studies, in feminist technology studies, and the sort of STS movement, which focuses on looking at technology in its social context. So she develops a social constructionist perspective to open up possibilities for transforming technology in ways that support gender equality. So the social constructionist perspective dispenses with and criticizes the essentialist view that technology is a single thing and it determines its own sort of social application, that it's a sort of single idea or has an essence that is sort of played out socially. So social constructionism disagrees with that idea and argues that we can transform technology from the way that it works, from the sort of social context within which it works, by finding ways to sort of push for other uses for technology, to transform it, to serve other needs, and so on. So this is sort of typical of the social constructionist view. So Faulkner says that social constructivism resonates with the ambivalence that women experience in encounters with technology. So rather than seeing technology as determined by patriarchy, social constructivism sees gender and technology as shaped or co-produced by society and culture. So gender and technology are both kind of co-shaped or co-produced out of technology and culture. And the idea that this view develops is that you can see both patriarchy, you can see both sort of gender, and you can see both technology as being shaped by the structure of society. And if society has a kind of patriarchal character, then that structuring will affect both, of course, technology, and it will obviously affect gender. So the social structure, and especially if there are patriarchal elements in society, those elements will sort of co-produce gender and technology. In other words, it's not, the point here is that it's not a determinist thing. Patriarchy or capitalism doesn't determine the shape of technology, but the sort of, the social context, which includes patriarchy, may shape both technology and gender at the same time, those two things being co-produced by the way the social context works to enforce particular kinds of perspectives and particular kind of interests. All right. So Faulkner says that in a very real sense, constructivist technology studies argue those who design technologies are by the same stroke designing society. Right. So here's the point about the context, and within the social context, excuse me, you have you have quite a considerable leeway to design technologies in a way that serves certain kind of purposes that are not intrinsically technological, right? So those purposes could be, serving the ends of a kind of patriarchal system, shoring up a system of male dominance. Those sort of ends could be ensuring the success of a particular privileged group. But technology is in sort of designing technology, the designing is importing social values into the technology itself. Now, there are two parts of this constructivist idea that Faulkner emphasizes here. First thing she emphasizes is interpretive flexibility, and she means here that when a new technology is introduced, there's considerable flexibility about what it's going to look like, about the shape it's going to have, about what ends it's going to serve. The example she uses here comes from a very famous and influential study by Biker and Pinch in 1984, and that study focused on the development of the bicycle in the 19th century, right? And at the time that the bicycle was becoming was being invented and was taking shape as a sort of social technology, there were two competing designs that were sort of competing to see which one could be the socially dominant design. And there was a focus on speed in one of them, and there was a focus on the value of safety in the other one. And this picture here with the big wheel, this is a bicycle that is designed for speed rather than safety. So a sort of bicycle like this brings forward, and it's sort of designed for sport, I guess we'd say. It imparts a certain structure of values to the object itself. So the object is seen as something that's seen as good for racing. It's a sport thing. It's a sort of it's something you do for exercise, something like that. Whereas the other design with two sort of wheels, of much smaller wheels of the same size, by representing safety, gives a kind of different valence, a different value to the technology. In that case, it looks more like safety. You can imagine riding it around town to work, going from place to place in a job and stuff like that. So it's sort of different from the idea of a kind of a racing bike. So these two designs were competing, socially competing, to see which idea and consequently which set of values would become dominant. Right. So the constructivist claim is that this happens with any technology when it's introduced. We have this element of interpretive flexibility that allows for different values to compete to determine which one will actually be embodied in the technology itself when it's finished. So will it be the values of and the interests of people who want a racing bike, or will it be the values of people who want a bike that's nice and safe and secure for when they ride to work and ride about town? So these different values competed for the bike, according to Biker and Pinch in their study in the 19th century. But so the constructivist idea is we can see that fight when we, in any technology that comes into being, we're going to see that struggle in play, right? So that raises a lot of really important questions about who gets to design technology, how do we decide which technologies become socially dominant, what's the process by which that happens? Can we make that process amenable to some kind of democratic debate and oversight? So these are some of the debates that have come out of the social constructivist claim that Faulkner's developing here. The second thing she mentions, the unintended consequences. Sometimes a technology by the way it's without this being foreseen, it can have consequences for a certain group or for a certain number of users. She mentions here the way Victorian buildings, old buildings, excluded wheelchair users, which wasn't intentional, but it was an effect of the way the buildings were designed. So again, by those consequences, a technology can have positive effects. It can sort of it can push forward the values, the ideals of certain groups, and it can impede the sort of social status, and the values of other groups who may need other things and other approaches. So we can see unintended consequences as a further way in which a technology will affect relations between different social groups. So the question, how is technology gendered, or how does gender enter into technology and become a part of technological artifacts? I think there are three main claims that Faulkner makes in this paper. She mentions four, but I think we can condense them to three. The first one, the nuts and bolts of technical artifacts. So the artifacts themselves can be seen to be gendered in the way that they work, in the values they embody. Secondly, masculine images of technology that contribute to the male dominance of technological occupations. Excuse me. So part of this is the sort of social, the social significance of technology, the way that we see it, the way that we understand it as a career, as a social sphere, and the way that seems to encode masculine rather than feminine ideals. And thirdly, the importance of technology to the gender identities of men who work and play with technology. So it becomes something that men who work in the technology and work in the technology field come to see as a part of their identity, that they're fluent with technology, that they understand how it works. Even the idea of of working alone on a sort of technical problem is sort of part of that gender identity, so there's this sort of clash between male instrumentalism and the sort of female focus on social relationships. And of course, that opposition is itself sort of socially constructed, but it plays into the way a particular profession and its image of who does it and why they do it can appeal to a particular gender identity rather than a different one. All right, so let's take the first claim, gender. Well, let's look at this distinction first: the gender in versus gender of technology. So in the first case, gender relations are actually embodied in artifacts, part of their very design and material makeup. That's the gender in technology. In the second case, the gendering occurs by association. So we talk about parts in engineering as having male and female parts. That's not intrinsic to the technology. That's part of the language with which people talk about it, giving it a sort of gendered language by association. Or domestic technologies marketed to women that are sort of seen as typically associated with women, or other sort of technologies marketed to men. Maybe sort of outdoor gardening sort of equipment tends to be more marketed to men, whereas domestic technologies sort of used in the kitchen tend to be marketed to women. So that's another sort of case of the gendering of technology, where we associate male and female with male and female images with particular technologies, and they get linked to gender in a sort of secondary social way. All right, so to take the first point about gender in artifacts, we can look at the microwave, I think, as an example of this, process. So the microwave was originally designed to appeal to single men through providing simple pre-prepared meals. Then it was redesigned with more complex cooking controls to appeal to the household in which women does most of the cooking. Right. So here that it's like a kind of a gender identity is built into the product itself. It's constructed with an ideal in mind of a woman in the home who does the cooking, and through that ideal, it's sort of marketed as a particular kind of good, and that ideal of a woman who's skilled at using a sort of a technical device for cooking, that's then designed into the product. So here we have a case where products are designed and created in such a way that they encode or they embody particular kind of gender values, or a particular construction of gender as being, women sort of competent in the kitchen, men less competent in the kitchen, and it sort of embodies those values in products, in making them appeal to those particular gender identities. So the second thing she talks about here, the masculine images of technology, and the discussion between feminine expressiveness and masculine instrumentalism. So the shortage of women in computer science, the disparity between men and who study computer science and women is often related to the association of computers with images of masculine asociality, right? So the sort of familiar social image that people who are interested in computers and programming are, they're either nerds or they're hackers, they're asocial, they work alone, they're not groupy, they don't sort of join groups and sort of do things together, they're very much loners. So that association ties into the constructed idea of masculine instrumentalism, that men prefer to solve problems, whereas the feminine expressiveness idea is that women prefer social relationships, and are much more comfortable in sort of settings where those social relationships have a large role. And again, like I said, that's a sort of constructed opposition. It expresses the way we've sort of constructed socially male and female relations. But here in that image being powerful in computer science, and by sort of tying into this idea of masculine instrumentalism, it makes it more difficult for women who sort of associate more with the expressiveness idea, makes it more difficult for them to see, for example, computer science as a career that might be appropriate for them. Third, the gender identity and technology. And she mentions here the pleasure that men take in technical prowess and in exercises of power over the world mean that technology fits very well with the everyday gender identities of men. So again, the sort of instrumentalism idea, and the sort of pleasure in technical control, in mastering a piece of the world, a piece of equipment, or a piece of technology, fits well with the men's sort of common everyday gender identities, and is sort of less tied to the sort of the relationship focused way that female gender identity works. So here it's not part of the technology itself, but again part of its social symbolism, that it appeals to features of men's identities that go well with the sort of the way the technology is designed to function. All right, so let's look at Faulkner's conclusions and sort of think about some of the issues raised here. So she says that social constructivism allows us to see gender as a crucial part of the social shaping of technology, right? So gender is not just it's not just part of the environment around technology, but it shapes technology itself, and it shapes the sort of structure of the technologies we see. Interesting example here is the Lego Friends series, which has become very popular in the last 15 years or so. But it's come in for some criticism, designed by Lego, and it's been criticized for Lego Friends, which has been a range of toys aimed at girls, and it features 5 women who live in this sort of fictional area, and it has, there's a salon, there's a vet, there's a swimming pool, convertible cars and stuff, and so what people sort of notice and remark here is the kind of passivity of the figures, I guess, that they're not really doing professional work. They're kind of sitting around combing their hair and sort of going to the, being at the swimming pool. So it clashes with other Lego products that tend to figure individuals doing very sort of socially valuable kind of work, or doing specific kinds of specific, whether they're astronauts, whether they're doing some kind of other work that has some social value to it. So it's here it seems to sort of play into a lot of those stereotypes about the sort of stereotypes about the sort of everyday leisure and sort of women being in this sort of non-working environment. So it's been criticized for those reasons, and also for some of the designs are said to be, it relies on these simple colors. There's a lot of pinks and purples, and the designs are perhaps kind of simple when they're compared with other sort of complex products which are perhaps marketed more to boys. So there's a lot of criticism about this, but it shows us how unwittingly, it shows us how gender can be sort of built into products in how they appeal to men or women, boys and girls, and how they do that partially is by sort of building in sort of the structure of gender into the or the sort of the value, the meanings of gender into the product itself. Now, the second point that Faulkner makes is that, and here returning to the idea of actor network theory that we looked at last week, the idea of actor network theory that artifacts are non-human actors integral to the social fabric provides valuable tools for feminist thinking about technology. So, for example, we can ask, how far is patriarchy embodied in actual devices and things, as well as being beliefs held by people, right? So here the idea of actor network theory of human actors as being able to sort of perform human tasks, as being able to sort of carry out social values and norms. So here we can extend that and say, well, if that's true, it's possible they would be able to, the devices and technology might be able to sort of enforce patriarchal norms, male-dominated norms as well. And of course, this can, again, this can happen unintentionally, but it happens unintentionally, of course, because much of the technology itself already bears the capacity to be valence towards male values and to value sort of certain types of calculation and interestedness rather than sort of other things. So this was a recent story about Amazon that ditched an AI recruiting tool that favored men for technical jobs. So it was an AI algorithm recruiting tool that was supposed to review job applicants' resumes and finding, sort of mechanizing the search for top talent, getting a sort of pool of the top applicants. But Amazon found that the machine was turning up a far greater number of men as candidates than women, much more than if they had human beings look through the applications rather than an AI algorithm. So the technology itself, then, whatever it was doing and however it was doing it, it was showing bias towards male candidates, and doing it not sort of not deliberately from a values perspective, but having that partiality and having that sort of that patriarchal identity built into it as a machine, as a program. So it's a nice example of how those values can be actually built into the technology itself, and it doesn't actually need people to make the decisions to sort of drive that structure of patriarchy. So this is a nice way of challenging the idea of technology as a neutral tool, right? And it shows that when you design technology in a setting where gender relations are in conflict, and there is a sort of dominance hierarchy going on, to design technology in that context, it's highly likely that the technology will take on the characteristics of patriarchy or whatever other values are dominant socially. And finally, and importantly, Faulkner says, we cannot transform gender relations without engaging in technology. So it's important to develop strategies to intervene in the process of designing new technologies. So it's not, it's not just complaining and sitting on the sidelines, but the call here is to engage in the process of designing technologies in order to sort of transform how technologies work to shore up certain kinds of hierarchies in society. All right, that point takes us on nicely to Els Roms and her paper on feminist interventions in the design process. Roms makes the point that the problem with many products that try to be gender sensitive or gender specific is that they end up reinforcing stereotypes. This was one of the problems with Lego Friends, of course, and it's this problem with these Bic pens for her is that they're just there's no reason whatsoever for this product. There's no that women and men don't use pens differently, and all it ends up doing is promoting a very sort of superficial focus on color. Women like pink and purple, so let's focus on that for our pens. So all it ends up doing if you try to be gender specific often is that it ends up just focusing on stereotypes. So we need a different approach that doesn't appeal to existing sort of beliefs about how gender works, but tries to think critically beyond those beliefs and those stereotypes about what genders do and how they work and how they're different. So we need something that sort of reaches beyond that. So Rom says that rather than focusing on how products are gendered, we need to focus more on how technologies can contribute to the transformation of gender in society. So rather than looking at how sort of looking at gendering and sort of criticizing criticizing existing technologies for being too masculine, rather than taking a sort of fixed idea of masculine and feminine or male and female. We need to look at how we can create technologies to contribute to a transformation of how we think about gender, a transformation of how we think gender works. So technologies that are creative in how they appeal to females and males, and are creative in how they kind of break down existing gender divisions and the sort of working of those gender divisions. All right, so let's look at some of the design methodologies that Roms mentions, and here she's talking about a study that was done in the European Union about different design processes in some major corporations that they looked at, and they outlined and separated a number of different design processes. And the first and the most problematic one, of course, designing from gender stereotypes. And here women are generally represented as neither interested nor skilled in technology, and as preferring user-friendly, i.e. simplified interfaces. So it assumes a kind of hesitancy or perhaps fear of technology among women, and tries to appeal to that by sort of more simplified, non-scary interfaces and approaches that maybe, again, use simple colors that sort of draw in and are not threatening. So it tends to, this always leads to, simply taking the existing stereotypes and designing for them rather than really challenging them. The second approach, the reflexive I methodology. So the I methodology designs based on the designer's own preferences. So it could be a male designer or a female designer sort of thinking about their own preferences, thinking about, what they would want to see in a product and their own values. In its reflexive form, designers take account of how their own perspectives and situation make them similar to and different from end users. So in the reflexive form, they're trying to take account of the difference between their perspective of designers and the perspective of end users who will be actually using the technology. And this sort of makes them more able to reach out beyond their own perspective and to think about how others might be, how their own situation might be different to actual users of the technology itself. Thirdly, user testing and participatory design, which involves the testing of products on actual users, or so-called participatory design. Also, users are actually involved in the design of the product. They sort of test it, they give their feedback, and so on. So although it helps overcome some defects in other models, one problem, says Faulkner, is how to achieve an adequate degree of representativeness. So of course, if you're going to test them on users, how do you make sure those users are representative? What are your sort of criteria of representativeness? How do we sort of represent the sort of the categories of gender and race and class and ethnicity, and make sure that there's enough representativeness in that process? Okay, so to sum up and think about what we want to say and where we go next with this, it's impossible to say in advance which design process will prove successful at generating transformative technological change, but encouraging designers to become aware of their feminist values along with other values might help make their design choices more sensitive to the problem. So Roms is sort of saying to encourage designers themselves to reflect on their own values and sort of encourage them to see what those values are, and to make designers more self-aware when they design products of the values that they're inputting into them and to see the implications of those values. And I think the participatory process is an important thing here as well, to make sure that you design a process that's representative and that gives people a chance to interact and to give feedback to designers and people doing the design work, so that there's an interplay there. All of those things might lead to, I think, a more transformative design process, rather than, again, relying on existing ideas of what gender means and how it works, which tends to make gender stereotypical products.